in a very informal way today, since we had the formal reading yesterday, I'd just like to introduce DT Max. DT Max works. Daniel works for the New Yorker. The book that we'll be talking about today is called "Every Love Story is a Ghost Story," which is a biography of David Foster Wallace. Out of curiosity, how many of you have read this? To call you all out. Okay, that's nice. So this book came out in 2012. Was a New York Times bestseller. And Daniel's also the author of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a medical mystery, which he talked about earlier today with the medical students. So he's really making the interdisciplinary rounds while he's here. Anyway, Daniel lives in New Jersey now. We'll talk more about parts of your work and life as we go on. But yeah, and I really want this to be kind of an informal back and forth in a lot of ways. But the stuff that I'd like to touch upon is especially Dave's teaching, his thought, and maybe ending with a little bit of discussion about the Pale King in particular. I mean, we tend to talk about Infinite Jest much more often, but there's more to say about the Pale King and his work in the final years. So I'm just going to start off with one question, and I have many others. Oh, and I should add, the reason that I'm here, I guess, is I was one of Dave's students at Pomona in the 2002 to 2004 range, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. But so one of the things I really love about this book is it offers such a balanced account, which somebody brought up yesterday, where you don't get the sense of Wallace as either being a tragic genius or something like that, or a total rake, as you were saying, right? I mean, you get elements of both at different moments. And one of the kind of most embattled moments, or the most embattled threads in Dave's life had to do with his mother, it seems. And I hoped you could tell us a little bit about that. Right, you talk about the domineering character of Avril and Cadenza in Infinite Jest being kind of avatar for his mother. And then later in his life, you have this comment that he makes to Karen Green, his wife at that point, that he couldn't remember where the rift had exactly come from. So I wonder if you could give us a kind of account of maybe some of the sources of that tension, which often brought out some very dark sides of him.
I mean, I'm not sure I know a ton more than is in the book, but and in some ways I think it's actually his behavior is sort of very typical. Even so, when Patrick knew David, it's in Pomona, which it turns out to be sadly the last years of his life. And by that time, I think he had made a big effort to not only be more mature, but to portray himself as more mature. And so I think part of that was certainly acting as if the things that had agitated him in his 30s, his mother being very high up on the list, had all been kind of placed in a more comfortable place for him. What was it about his mother? His mother is a very, very bright woman. She was a lot of people don't realize this, but I mean, she was a creative person as well. Although I think she had written some plays and stuff. But they're in Champaign-Urbana. His father is the better known of the two. In the couple, he's a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, but his mother is a very, very engaged and charismatic teacher, really, more than anything else, at Parkland Community College. And if you want to find something, sort of an interesting document, his mother wrote a book called Practically Painless English, and it's sort of a collector's item because it's one of the weirdest sort of English as a second language textbooks you'll find, because there's a lot of her sense of humor in some of the sample sentences. I can't remember them, but there might be a sentence like, the ape took the banana and hit me on the head with it. And so that's, on the one hand, he's teaching you, subject, verb, object, but on the other hand, it's also obviously sort of Sally Wallace's sense of humor poking out. I think that what happened, I think is very typical also for men of a certain age to start casting around and trying to figure out why they're not in a successful relationship. And the true north for that kind of analysis is almost always the mother, very rarely the father. And so in his 30s, partially under sort of the you can find analogs to all these things in Infinite Jest, but basically under the sort of gentle or not so gentle insistence of Mary Carr, the poet, memoir writer. David starts going to therapy, and his gaze, comes round to his mother. And his belief really, I think, essentially is that his mother wanted him to be the success she wasn't, that his mother wanted him, treated him as an object. He comes upon this book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. I don't know how many of you have come upon that book, but it's very enticing from the title on down. It's by a writer named Alice Miller. And I think the actual original German title is much drier, but some genius retitled it when it came into English as The Drama of the Gifted Child. So who wouldn't pick that up, right? There are these notes I saw where he talks about his mother is putting him up on a pedestal and turning him into an object and not loving him for who he is. And you can find sort of more disturbing fictional kind of analogs of that in the story Suicide is a Sort of Present. How many of you know that story from Oblivion? So in that story, it's basically, I think, an attempt to fictionalize what he believes is going on, where there's a mother and a son locked in a kind of endless battle of both narcissism and kind of her admiration and hopes for him. And in that story, and I don't know how deeply David believed this in real life, she's herself responding to her own upbringing and her own inability to admit or acknowledge that she's an imperfect parent because, her own parents, I can't remember the details, but her own parents brought her up unable to admit any sort of failure. So it becomes a kind of cycle, a depressing cycle. And with that title, you can imagine, where that cycle is meant to end. But anyway, by the time he meets Patrick, I think he's, probably genuinely pushed that. He's in a successful relationship, and I think one of the results of that is that he no longer focused so much on his mother, and I think probably Karen Green encouraged him to get over it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things for me is he would oftentimes return my papers with photocopies of pages from his mother's book, and actually like grammar textbooks where he would underline or highlight the things that I had, terribly erred in.
With David, all these actions, as I think with many very smart people, are they consist in equal parts of a sincere gesture and a parody. So David would be aware at once of the utility of his mother's book, the ridiculousness of a 40-year-old man cutting out pages from his mother's grammar book, and also of the fact that he was kind of in this way burying, I think, if you want to say there were real issues remaining between them, this is his way of acknowledging that they were not going to be dealing with those real issues. They were going to be treating each other. And even in the worst times of their relationship, and I don't think that Sally Wallace could have been thrilled with her portrait in Infinite Jest. Even in the worst times of the relationship, they always communicated about grammar. It was a little bit like a father and son who can't talk but who can go hunting together or something. You know what I mean? It was a kind of a nonverbal communication, a safe area of communication for them.
So one distinction that came up a lot in Dave's teaching was one between sympathy and empathy, right? That I want to talk a little bit about in relation to his thought as well. Right, I mean, for him, sympathy was something that happened more from a distance, obviously. It was entailed forms of tolerance, of cognitive understanding, perhaps something even like pity, whereas empathy was a much more difficult and engaged project. And in fact, I remember you saying yesterday after your reading that this was a difficult thing for him to grasp, whereas for a lot of folks, empathy comes very naturally. And for me, empathy is perhaps the most difficult thing. I don't know if that's me or if that's the challenge of really putting yourself wholly into somebody else's perspective or somebody else's shoes. But for him, I always felt that his fiction and his writing was a way to be speculative in a way that would enable forms of empathy. Because empathy, if we're being honest about it, is always a speculative gesture. It's always a movement outside of oneself. And there's this great line that you quote from Sven Berkertz in your book, where he describes Dave's writing as, I'm quoting this, Wallace does not in fact tell the story. Instead, he inhabits for extended moments the airspace around his characters. And I think that's a fantastic way to capture what his sentences are doing as well. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his relationship to empathy and the way that inhabiting one's airspace might be an attempt to engage in what I think is ultimately an impossible project of empathy, but one that's maybe more important than any other.
I think what Patrick says is exactly right. For him, empathy was the goal. You have to remember that for much of David's life, he's in, a 12-step program where I think empathy is being taught constantly. I mean, if David has a church, there are a lot of pieces where David says he's what does he say? He says he met, his piece about 9/11, he talks about meeting some of the other people in the story at his Mennonite church. But David wasn't a member of a Mennonite church. I mean, his church was his 12-step program. And I think, the secular religion of that program was really, I think, about understanding other people rather than judging them. And David had grown up in a fairly conventional, 1970s opinionated household. Smart parents, I think not at all afraid to show their smartness. In some ways, I think they could be pretty disdainful of other people, also dependent on who they were talking about. And I think for David, the great association of his middle years is really that empathy helps the empathizer. I think that's a lot of what his 12-step program shows him, is it isn't just a gesture that's kind to other people. It's a gesture that can help preserve yourself basically from addiction. But I'd be curious, on your part, Patrick, because you actually sat in rooms with David. The closest I ever got was the publication party for Infinite Jest, where he looked like he couldn't get out of there fast enough, and there were a couple hundred other people in the room. My impression, and I write this in the book, is that his empathy was always sort of forced. There's a certain kind of person, I think, who can assume the forms of some kinds of interactions, and you're never entirely convinced that on the deepest level that those interactions are natural for them. I mean, there's some people who are not sociable who can affect sociability for a time. There are some people who are not necessarily kind who can be kind for a period of time. And that, there's that line I quote from his Pomona time where he introduces himself to his students. And he says, I'm going to remember your names long after you've forgotten mine. And I've always thought, well, that's obviously on the surface simply not true. They were never going to forget they were in a class with David Foster Wallace. I mean, he was already a famous teacher and a kind of, a figure of some size on the campus. So, well, why would he have said that? And what's your understanding of how that would have, what that would have meant coming out of his mouth?
I mean, I actually think, empathy didn't come naturally to him, but the fact that he worked at it as hard as he did seems even more meaningful to me. And there were always, complex things happening under the surface, which was evident. I mean, so something that I told you before when we were talking, for the hour before this is when we first met, I took an independent study with him where we were looking at contemporary literature. We read Gravity's Rainbow, we read Waiting for the Barbarians, we read White Noise, a bunch of theory as well. I can say more about that time, but the important point is he immediately saw that I was beating myself up more about the mistakes that I was making than anything that he could ever do. And so he ended, that to me was a form of empathy, the fact that he had a sensitivity to be able to pick that up and as a teacher respond to it in that individual case. So instead of applying his theory of pedagogy to all situations, he took the great situation that he was in at Pomona, which is that he had essentially 12 students at any given moment in his one creative writing seminar, in this case his independent study, and really gave, wrote you these 2-page single-spaced letters to your story that was that same length, or in this case, really saw what I needed and responded in a very kind way. But and I think where you started, the key qualifier that you threw out was I knew him at a very particular moment in his life, and it was one that where he was being really mindful about being an adult. He made a lot of jokes about having to get into his adult clothes, for instance, and going out into the world and having to do a reading or something like that. And as he preferred wearing shorts and t-shirts. But he was very mindful about being an adult in the sense of maturity and empathy and working on these things. And having Karen in his life, I think, was a huge motivator for that as well.
I was just going to read this. This was by a student who was in one of his creative writing classes. You were ever in a group class with him, or only the one-on-one?
Just the one-on-ones.
He said, it's going to take me 2 weeks to learn everyone's name, but by the time I learn your name, I'm going to remember your name for the rest of my life. There's an unhappy overtone to it now, but I don't. Nothing was meant by it then. You're going to forget who I am before I forget who you are. I mean, it's an odd statement because there's so much wishing in it. Really, I mean, it's not really a statement referent to reality. They weren't gonna forget him. Um, I think that David, as a teacher, just from all the interviewing I did, there's an old cliche in journalism that the purpose of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I actually think David's teaching was not so far from that point either, because he very much disliked confidence and even more cockiness, and I think even more male cockiness. There's an element of threat and competition to that. And he also saw, I remember this is more at Illinois State where he is before he goes to Pomona, that the more, there were a couple of students who were naturally gifted comic writers, young men, and whose stories were huge crowd pleasers. And he gave these guys such a hard time. I remember one of them, he pulls him out after class and he says to this young man, he says, I've never witnessed such a collective cocksucking before in my life. So, which, you got to figure that someone's going to use, and then he asked the guy if he plays tennis. So, David's a very good tennis player, and this guy's a fairly slight fellow who clearly was, he wasn't going to play tennis. David wasn't going to play tennis with him to see if he could lose. He's going to completely wipe the court with his ass.
He was totally self-deprecating about his tennis skills.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Well, but I think he knew word had gotten out. So, I mean, it's an interesting situation with Patrick. I think he found, as it happens, you guys found each other. We talked about this a bit, but I think your idea there is accurate, that he, having himself, as a guy who beat himself up relentlessly, he would have had a sensitivity to other young men who did that. And that would probably, I mean, just guessing here, would be the kind of young man with whom he could enter into a very fruitful teaching relationship, because that whole piece of him didn't have to apply. Like, he didn't have to cut you down, because you cut yourself down. So he could work on whatever level you wanted to work to help you gain confidence and knowledge.
Yeah, there was. I mean, at times it felt very much actually like a tennis match, and I hadn't thought about it in quite this metaphorical sense. But one example that I was giving you earlier as well is, he would, we'd be doing this independent study first on fiction, then in a kind of creative writing way, and he would give me these short assignments of write, 4 or 5 pages on this topic, and I would come back with like a 25-page paper, and then he would, line edit the hell out of this thing and write me a 2-page letter at the end. And then I would go home and go through each line edit and write responses to each of those notes and take it back to him and ask him these questions. And he would respond and give me additional pages from the grammar textbook. And it just went back and forth like this for the longest time, up to the point where he actually kind of had a grin on his face about what was happening.
I think that is very important. Grammar was a great battle for David, and the fact that most students could not write a grammatical sentence either at Pomona or at ISU. I mean, drove him batshit.
Totally.
He just hated it, and he hated typos. It's funny. I mean, David was to some extent a figure of kind of a certain kind of improvisational, almost modern countercultural kind of beneficence was actually, I think, in some ways, a complete tight ass. A bit of Squidward in him.
I mean, he was totally a grammar Nazi, which is what he called himself. And in fact, when he signed Oblivion for me at one point, he wrote "P.S. Proofread" at the end after his name.
Yeah.
Which
I mean, it's funny. But what do you make? I mean, what do you make of that as a piece of his? I mean, is it just his love of systems? He likes systems. He wrote a book about infinity. I mean, is that part of it? Is it grammar as a philosophical system, or is it what?
Yeah, I mean, we ended up talking about systems theory very often. I mean, I think part of it was also the kind of precision that you're taught to have as an analytic philosophy major in particular. So I think the time that he was working on logic and continental philosophy moved him in that direction. I mean, surely his mother as well, and that grammar work.
But I mean, it's curiously trivial, don't you think? I mean, for instance, I'm a professional writer at the New Yorker, and I don't really know grammar. I mean, I give it my best shot. There are people who clean up after me, but which is good. I mean, my grammar's not terrible, but I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't pass his examination. I think his implication would be sloppy writing leads to sloppy thinking, but I would still say there's a difference between knowing, grammar itself. I'm trying to remember there's a guy who just published a book called Quack This Way, which is a little explanation, little investigation of his relationship with Wallace and Grammer, because they were friends, and this guy published a book on usage, which is what David used as his jumping off point for the wonderful Harper's piece on American usage. But anyway, and this guy's a very nice guy. He's as good a grammarian as David, and yet he's not a writer. I mean, being a grammarian doesn't make you a writer, and if you're in creative writing, useful, I'm not talking about writing a sentence that conveys what you mean, but being a grammarian doesn't make you a writer. It's an odd sort of misdirection on his part, I feel.
Well, so I actually have a pre-prepared question that I can ask you that speaks directly to this point, I think. No, it's just a lucky thing. No, it's not. Well, it's actually, I mean, I wanted to bring some of Dave's language into this space as well, because, I mean, the reason I think most of us are here is because of his sentences and his narratives and his thought. And there's a quotation that I love from Infinite Jest that raises a question maybe about grammar as well. Toward the end of the novel, I think it's the last 20% of it or so, he writes, "We're all dying to give our lives away to something, maybe, God or Satan, politics or grammar, topology or philtly. The object seemed incidental to this will to give oneself away utterly to games or needles, to some other person, something pathetic about it, a flight from in the form of a plunging into. Flight from exactly what? These rooms blandly filled with excrement and meat. To what purpose? This was why they started us here so young." This is at the tennis academy. "To give ourselves away before the age when the questions why and to what grow real beaks and claws. It was kind in a way." So that's the quotation. And and Dave also observes something in the passage that follows about limited attention capacities, and how we have to be careful about what we choose to love, which is a point that gets taken up in the Pale King in a more extensive way. And so I guess a question that I had about this was, given your work with the archives and so many of the people that he loved and loved him, what would you say that David chose to love?
Well, I think the one thing that, you guys hear me without this, okay?
Well, this is for the.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were just trying to reach the sandwiches in the back. Well, so what did David choose to love? That's a central question of the biographical effort, right? I mean, it's every love story is a ghost story. There's a reason for that title. On a narrow level, clearly grammar is, in a funny way, I think maybe the only thing I can track from the beginning of his life to the end of his life, for which his affection never faltered. There is no moment, even when he's kind of remaking his personality in this halfway house, where he doesn't care about grammar. He's always precise in that regard. There's a letter he wrote that I quote in the biography, where he writes to one of his editors and he says, I think he's expecting the galleys of one of his stories, which he had finished and submitted before he went into the halfway house, where he says, feel free to send the page whenever you have a moment. I'm not going anywhere. So, but what's interesting about that for me is partially, the joke, the self-deprecating joke that he's now in a halfway house, but also that he cares enough about the galleys of his story, even in this moment of extremity. I mean, for all of us who are writers, it's not surprising, but it is surprising, that he wouldn't let a galley page go, even when he's supposed to be in the midst of sort of, getting off of his addictions and remaking his personality. So yeah, he did love that his whole life. I think the obvious answer is from the time he has. If you were here yesterday, you know that David really wasn't a writer in his teens. I don't believe there's like piles of wonderful stories from his high school years that will make your jaws drop the way there are for some writers. He really becomes a writer very quickly in college after he has a couple of breakdowns. But I think writing is probably the thing to which his, that's the thing that I think he would have said he chose to love. And I think it's most clearly seen in his later years when, David and Patrick can really talk to this. We were talking about this a little bit downstairs, but it confirmed what was in the book, which as a person who's published a book is always, I can tell you, an enormous relief. When you should never do interviews after you've finished a book, first of all. But you can't help it when Patrick and I didn't have a lot of time to talk when I was working on the book. So it's a huge relief to find that the portrait you've drawn is, in fact, consistent with new information. But at the end of his life, right, he's very happy. And in fact, there are moments, Patrick happens to have had interactions with him where he talks about, or Patrick can see that this is the happiest time he's ever known David. But the thing he doesn't give up is the writing. I mean, that's the thing that makes him go off of the antidepressant that's kept him alive for so many years. And there's other reasons he went off it, but really the primary reason is he's never stopping to be a writer. So all the time that he's in Pomona at the end of his life, he's got this manuscript in the garage that he's supposed to be working on, finishing on, and has the whole kind of complement of kind of weight put on his shoulders that, it has to be better than Infinite Jest. It has to be as meaningful Infinite Jest. We have to like it as much as Infinite Jest, which of course he can't remotely control. The critics have to consider it worthy of the author of Infinite Jest. All the funders who gave him money during the years when he was supposed to be working on it have to think it was a project worthy of funding. Don DeLillo, his pen pal, has to think it's a great book. I mean, there's a lot of weight on his shoulders, but I think writing remains really for him, as for many writers, but I think in a really unusual way for him because he's having so much trouble writing. We were talking about his nonfiction yesterday, and I think in an interesting way, we'll talk about Pale King. I think Patrick is going to make a more of a case for it than most people make. But, thinking about it, you have to say that those nonfiction pieces written in the 90s and the 00s were a place where his love of language has a really, really deep and free play. And if you go back to them, not on the level of what they're about, but just look at the sentences, although he would have said that they were just scribblings. Like, I just think that a lot of work and joy went into those pieces.
So let's talk about one other thing that he loved in a kind of ambivalent way, I guess, and this is one preoccupation that I share with him is a love of media. I mean, in the sense of television, right? Not in the sense of the media that was interviewing him and whatnot. But he grew up watching a whole lot of television. Later in his life, he wouldn't have a television in his house or in his apartment, but he would bring one in at moments where there was a little bit more time. So when I was staying at his house one summer, he brought in a small television with a VCR, where we ended up watching season 4 of The Sopranos together. So there was a kind of, he gave up alcohol, he gave up pot, but he didn't give up television to the very end.
Said it was his one true addiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally. And so I'm wondering, there's a kind of tension there, right? Where when he's writing Infinite Jest, he gives it the subtitle of a failed entertainment, right? Like at some level, he wants to write a failed entertainment. He wants to push back against that world. But on the other hand, right, he likes the attention to some degree. He wants to be successful. He wants to write a book that is greater than Infinite Jest. He wants to write an entertainment, right? And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the tension that I see between the kind of televisual and the literary, but also between a failed entertainment and a successful entertainment.
I think that that's a problem that he solved to his satisfaction in Infinite Jest. So his basic idea was that, fiction should not be easy, but it should also not be unreadable. He wasn't particularly a Finnegan's Wake kind of guy, actually. He really wasn't, and he had a well sort of often stated dislike of hypertext and so on. He wanted his fiction to kind of live in that spot where it challenged you, but it didn't defeat you. And I'm sure he was very disappointed that so many people who bought Infinite Jest, only got to page 70. That wasn't his goal. It really wasn't. He wanted readers. Every writer wants readers. That's obvious enough. But he also, there was some way in his mind in which a book that presented just enough difficulty became medicine rather than a drug. And I think with The Pale King, I think it works fine in Infinite Jest for a lot of different reasons, partially because I think he just was himself. He had so much going on in his own emotional life. I don't think he really was able to subject it to the kind of scrutiny that would ultimately defeat him. But by the time he gets to The Pale King, he's much happier, or by the time he really gets deeply into it. And there I find, I'd be curious if you agree, Patrick, that almost on the level of the sentence, you find David battling the question of just how amusing and how engrossing the sentences could be. You look at the beginning of the book, and there's a wonderful, fairly standard but quite beautiful American realist moment where, I forget the name of the character, lands in an airplane, and I guess it's Peoria, and it's just beautifully described. But then there's also a short section where you just have the names of different IRS examiners turning a page, right? Now, it doesn't go on very long, but it almost seems to me like that's the book that his theory of the book said he should write. And then the earlier part, the more sort of graceful, naturalistic part represented, I think, a way his mind was actually probably going when he wasn't pulling it back, if you know what I mean. What do you think for that?
I mean,
You're a close reader of the novel.
it would have been really interesting to see, obviously, where it would have gone if he had had the chance to revise it several times and make the cuts that he wanted. I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm so excited about with the Pale King that we have even, and this is something that I look around the room and I see several of my students that we've talked about a little bit in previous terms, is his engagement with boredom in that text. And, in the way that Infinite Jest for him was an attempt to produce a major leap in fiction, away from metafiction, for instance, toward this kind of sincerity, post-irony, whatever you want to call it, hyperrealism, that was in many ways very successful. I see an attempt not to recreate Infinite Jest, obviously. There's a very different pacing, there's a very different relationship to prose, but an attempt to grapple with something that actually wouldn't have necessarily caught on, but was one of the most important things that we can think about in the early 21st century, which is boredom. I mean, there are moments in that novel that are really, really boring, and I mean that as the highest compliment, right? I like, not vulgarly boring, like profoundly boring, right? Like there's this moment with the character David Wallace moving toward the IRS center, right, and being caught in traffic for pages and pages and footnotes and footnotes. It's unbearable, but at the same time, it's deeply interesting. How do you write something that is simultaneously interesting and profoundly boring? And he pulls it off, not for the entire duration of the piece, but there are moments in there, and the reason I think this is so timely is because we live in a moment where we can't be bored. We work all the time. We can text someone at any moment when we're bored. When we're waiting for someone and they're late, we go to our iPhones or our tablets. We're constantly distracted, and distraction is different than boredom, right? And he was able to sit with the idea of boredom and what you might gain on the other side of boredom if you allow yourself to encounter it, including the ugliness and the fear and the engagement with the issues that we push aside all the time, not just with our devices, but with our ways of being in the early 21st century.
The only part of that I don't think I quite agree with is that section is boring. I think David actually, despite sort of being an apostle for boredom and an advocate for boredom, was fundamentally a fairly cautious writer. And I think he worried in those sections. And I haven't read that little section for a while, but I remember it as being full of the kind of movement of his mind. Remember, there's always a difference as a writer between what you portray and how you portray it. So, you can portray boredom with language that simply is so alive that the reader really has almost a dissonance there. And I don't think he quite does that. But if we don't have the Pale King in the room, but I think he's afraid. I think his thesis and his creation are kind of at odds. There's wonderful language in his journals that I quote in the biography, where he sort of talks about how if you can break through, like he says, imagine the most boring thing in the world, and his example is televised golf, which I love. But if you think about that, isn't that already a movement of the mind that's not boring? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's already a surprise that you as a reader are not bored by the entrance of televised golf. And so I think that one of the problems he always had with the novel was that the fundamental thesis really he had to cut it so fine. I don't think he knew how to do it. And you said something else that caught my ear, which is if we only had the later versions, his chances to revise it. But I mean, he did have a lot of time. I mean, every book takes its own amount of time, and depending on what he was trying to do. Infinite Jest takes maybe only 3 years, I guess, actually, but that's unusual. He starts The Pale King in 1997, I think, as best as I could figure it out, and he dies in 2008, so that's 11 years with the book. I would argue more that he simply didn't know how to solve this problem either on the micro level of the sentence, but also on the macro level of what's to take place. But I'd be interested if that's how you read it.
Yeah, and I guess what I meant, like with this statement about what if we had the later version, I feel that more would have happened at the compositional level of rearranging sections and ordering. But I agree with you. I mean, there's a problem that isn't fully resolved, but is really, that he really grapples with. And when I say, I mean, like I was being semi-facetious in saying that I think that those parts of the novel are really boring. they are engaging at the sentence level, right? And I love hearing, the fourth and the fifth explanation of why the traffic is happening. Right. But at the same time, right, I mean, you also like grab your hair and like, do we really need this, additional footnote or endnote? But I do think that it's a novel that rewards, already in the state that we have it in, rewards close reading in a variety of ways, right? And that's another tension that I actually see in the text is in the Chris Fogel novella that Dan, I think, brought up yesterday in The Pale King is one of the strongest sections in the book, certainly about 100 pages, gives you a kind of tension where he's struggling. I mean, it's really a section that rewards close reading, but he keeps pushing against literature courses in this section, right? He keeps talking about how literature courses and humanities in general lack rigor and lack discipline, and slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, right? There's a kind of advocacy for economics and accounting courses and the rigor of the sciences in this, and yet, like, the quality of the sentences is totally pushing against the thesis as it's written out. So anyway, I mean, that's one place where I think where this kind of unresolved but productive tension plays out.
I mean, I'd be curious what you make of Oblivion, because I was just looking at, in the story Another Pioneer, which is one of the stories in Oblivion, as critics pointed out, the following words appear: evection, senescent, protasis, epitactic, himian, negrescently, todic, intallial, catastasis, and so on. I think if his goal was to really take you into a certain kind of brain phase, approximating boredom as a reader, I wonder if that isn't actually the place where he came closest.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is not going to be a very, very interesting response in some ways, but I was telling you earlier that when I was staying at his place, he allowed me to borrow his thesaurus sometimes, and because there was no access to internet, the 3 months that I was there, that was my best bet for that resource at least. And it was, and he really kept pushing on me the usefulness and the importance of a thesaurus. And he had, I think it was the Rogers thesaurus, or the one that gives you these kind of clusters of words rather than a single word followed by all of the different meanings. And one of his advocacies for that book, for that kind of thesaurus, is that it would get you to strange words and uncommon words, and would lead you back to these various etymologies. And I think that's one of the reasons why he loved grammar and language in the ways that he did, is it gave you a sense of structure and systematicity that spoke to him as a philosopher, but it also gave you that sense of history.
I think that's probably true, but I mean, there's a funny way in which in those stories in Oblivion, he doesn't recognize one of the basic things that most writers recognize, which is that the obscure word, often defeats the reader. And so most writers, I think, this is speaking very, very broadly in the American tradition, tend to stay away from the thesaurus. I mean, there's certainly a whole tradition. Hemingway is the most easily sort of parodied member of it, but it really goes back before him, where you find the accessible word. So if you use the word extrorse, which he uses in, I think it might be in the diving board story. What's the name of that story? Forever Overhead. Why? How many of us know what the word extrorse means? I didn't know what it means. I mean, it means twist. I think it means twisting and looking out at you. It may be an art term, but Zadie Smith did a brilliant essay where she traced that word to the very core of David's writing, which I thought was fascinating and really superb gesture. But on a more limited level, and a lot of Oblivion, the story collection, it should be noted, began as outtakes from The Pale King. I don't think all of it, but a lot of it. He was never not writing The Pale King. But there's this, for instance, when I was looking at some of his notebooks, and only a handful seem to exist, there's one section, I can't remember, I think it might be The Soul Is Not a Smithy, which is written in the notebook, and then he's written on it something like, already used. I think that's actually his words. So he must have want to make sure it didn't accidentally pop back up in The Pale King when he'd already sold it for scrap. But I do wonder then if Oblivion wasn't, I mean, even think about the title, wasn't his actual attempt to explore boredom in a more truly mimetic way.
Yeah, I mean, this speaks to a phrase that you bring up several times in the book, which is physics of reading, right? I mean, which is something that his editors tell him, I think. Yeah. I mean, this idea that you have to, it's unfortunate, but as a writer, you have to take into consideration your audience and the fact that there will be readers on the other end actually holding the book and doing things with it and spend money on the book, right? Right. There's I mean, literally a physics of reading. And so you're right. I mean, that's one moment where you think about using the most obscure word versus using the most accessible word. You're pushing against the physics of reading, much in the ways that he did that with his not his anti-climaxes, but his aclimaxes to both Infinite Jest and what he had planned, it seems, for the Pale King. But I actually, because we're talking about the physics of reading, I am sort of conscious of the physics of an atmosphere like this, and I want to kind of stop our conversation, give us a few minutes for people in the crowd to ask questions as well. So the physics of conversation, I guess.
So there's a moment, I think it's in Greek Confused in page 10, where Wallace talks about exactly this anxiety of the obscure word, but it's about the word wind. Do you know?
I don't remember, but what do you remember about it?
Like
One of my
he has
favorite
a
words.
very long footnote about his anxiety about wanting to use the word wind, feeling like it's the only word that will do,
Right.
and knowing that it will alienate his reader.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think you're right about this actually, because it was a different word initially, and he had to change it over to this in the revision because he had. This was, I think, one of the moments where there was the fear of plagiarism, right?
In brief interviews, that seems late for him to be afraid of.
Maybe it wasn't pre.
That's
Oh yeah,
moist.
yeah.
That's
It's
the moist
moist.
loincloth
Yeah.
problem.
Sorry.
That
That was different.
Well, that was actually not a fear. That was not a fear of plagiarism. That was the fear of Alex Trebek's lawsuit. But I don't remember. Is it in the story in Brief Interviews where he says you are unfortunately a fiction writer? That one, that I don't remember. Anyway, it would make some sense. I mean, the thing you really can't talk about David and not think about something he was thinking about. I mean, that's one of the pleasures and kind of challenges of discussing David Foster Wallace is that he was so smart and so fast. So on the one hand, you go, well, obviously, he chose to use these words. He wasn't an idiot. So it's clear that he decided that he could do more. I mean, every word has its own meaning anyway. I don't think that you can, substitute a word. But this movement towards, towards these Latinate and type words would have been a conscious choice on his part, and I think he would have certainly known that standard teaching in most creative writing classes, is prefers, the direct English or Anglo-Saxon word to the Latin. I mean, I think good writers invent their own language, but that's something all of us here, in Shakespeare, the writers, those people who use long-winded Latinate words are usually considered inferior to the ones who say, put up your swords for the bright dew will rust them. This kind of straight Anglo-Saxon preference. I mean, probably comes out of the sort of background, frankly, of the teachers who established the, English language canon in these places like Chicago in the 20s and 30s. But so I'm sure he thought about all these things, but and I'm not even necessarily certain that all of the stories in Oblivion, for that matter, come out of the same impulse. David, like most writers, is a bit of a scrap keeper, and so some of these stories may have been sitting around for years. But I think the main body of stories there has a weird kind of quiet around them. He tells his friend Mark Costello afterward, and I quote this in every love story, that he looked into the camera and didn't blink. And what he meant by that, according to Mark, because it can mean a lot of different things, was that he had used no tricks in Oblivion. But that's funny when you're using words like, well, not limb. The limb would be easy, extros and epitactic or whatever the word. I can even remember the words. I should also think we should never entirely discard the possibility that that David did want to be the smartest guy in the room, and just as grammar was a way of showing how much more work he'd done than you and how much more he remembered and how much faster he was, I think a vocabulary that would put most of us to shame was also a part of that. Part of David, was still a kind of earnest, even at the end, I think, earnest and enthusiastic about sort of conquering worlds of knowledge, and even his fondness for the thesaurus, I think, sort of speaks to that.
We take another question. Yeah.
So I would be appreciative to hear your thoughts on a certain section of all like puzzling sections in David Foster Wallace, I think it's like the most puzzling. Towards the end of The Pale King, there's a short chapter in which some narrator has to go babysit like an evil baby for the boss. And I've read this thing a couple times and I don't have any idea what to make of it. And I was just curious like, what your thoughts on this extremely confusing.
I'll just give a little. First of all, I want to compliment you on your choice of T-shirt. Let the record note that in Enfield Tennis Academy, the mythic academy in Infinite Jest, which is well then I actually want the substance abuse house T-shirt, but I don't have it. I'll just give you a little. It's called the compliance branch. That begins and has a long life as a story in Harper's and other places called the compliance branch. And so David wrote it early in the gestation of The Pale King, and some of his friends would say to me, we would see him read the compliance branch story again at some reading, and we realized how much trouble he was in because this is a story that we'd first heard, 5 years before. So the idea was that he wasn't creating new work that he was happy with. I'm going to let Patrick take at least a first shot, and maybe the only shot at its function in the book.
I mean, honestly, I would have to revisit that part of the novel. It's not fresh for me right now, but it always has felt to me as a very self-contained piece. I mean, it's extremely entertaining and readable and not boring in the ways that a lot of the other parts of the novel are. So I would have been especially curious with that piece where it was situated in relationship to the other parts, or whether there was some kind of extension that moved beyond it. But it does capture something about these office dynamics and the breakdown of the personal and the workspace in interesting ways that does carry through the rest of the novel.
Is that, I can't remember, is that so this is just a story, it's really almost a vignette, a very, very funny vignette about an IRS agent or accountant who's left with this baby, I guess a colleague's baby who becomes sort of, I can't remember, sort of impossible and morphs into this sort of dread kind of, world-ending misery but I can't remember. Is this a character who shows up elsewhere in the book? Because I don't remember.
He's not identified.
He's not identified. I remember when Michael Peach was putting the book together, was David's editor at the end of his life, much of his life, Little Brown. He had to try and figure out how these things related, and not all of them are actually evident in the story. For instance, if you remember the wonderful, strange mini-story Incarnations of Burned Children, right? That's a story about a child and some boiling water is spilled on the child, right? And if I remember right, so that child actually becomes one of the IRS agents. And I don't think, is that identified in The Pale King, or is it in my book? I can't remember if it shows up, but because it was a very tentative connection, and the pieces that should show you this are either not in The Pale King or never got written. I don't think they're in manuscript because I looked at the manuscripts of The Pale King, but there are ways. Who I think he grows up to be Drinyan, actually, if I'm remembering right. So probably, and I'm just guessing, and I haven't read the compliance branch section for a while. I'm imagining that character either was meant to appear other places or does appear, but the exigencies of publishing in a magazine maybe made it. That's the version Michael had, so he wasn't able to sort of definitively connect it. But the fact he put it in the book is interesting because there are pieces of The Pale King that were published, including a piece in the New Yorker, that didn't wind up in the book.
And the other thing to say about that piece, right, is there's a continuity between that and other parts of his writing insofar as like something terrible threatens to happen in that piece, but never entirely happens, right? So there's this resistance of closure that takes place. I mean, some of his really great comedic writing is taking place there, I think, at the sentence level in ways that you don't see always in other parts of that novel. I mean, the influence of television is all over that piece, I think, for me. The kind of hyper-realism that you talk about in the book a few times is certainly at play there, right? I mean, you have this great moment where you talk about the influence of Blue Velvet on his writing, this David Lynch film, and the ways that it helps him understand surrealism, right? So the best surrealism being sort of 99% realism, and then 1% something being just slightly askew. And in this case, right? I mean, you start off with the familiar office environment, and then you have this baby that seems to be taken out of a non-realist or surrealist situation. Another question? I don't know who was next. Here.
So my question is for Patrick. So in the American usage essay, there's this part where he's talking about what he might say to a student, maybe from like an African American household who maybe was struggling like writing classes, and he has this like really like firm delivery that he gives the student talking about standard English.
You may not like it. It may have no, core benefit. It may not be at its core better than, but you're going to have to speak it.
Right.
So
And my question for Patrick is, so in the American usage essay, he talked about how he says he might be getting pushback from other members of the creative writing faculty or his teaching. I was wondering if you saw any of that play out and what David's thought process was maybe surrounding that.
I mean, this goes back to the grammar conversation a little bit as well, and him seeing himself as a grammar Nazi, right? I really got the sense, because of his love of systems at some level, that he really wanted you to learn the rules as they existed and they were agreed upon by a discursive community before you were allowed to break those. And I did note, there were times where like one was allowed to break some of those rules, but he wanted, as a teacher, to have a clear sense of the fact that you had a sense of that starting point, those structures. I got a lot of that kind of thing from him for sure. And I was surprised at first, actually, in some ways, that he was so careful and proofread my stuff better than I did, and managed at first to really embarrass me to the point where I went through several drafts before he saw anything.
I would also just add, I think, as he got older, he probably thought about things that adults think about, like what is the value of an education. And he probably thought, if you don't come out of here speaking standard English, you're not going to get the job as a lawyer that your parents are going to hope you're going to get. And so I'm going to just give you this information. There's a little bit of that in the Kenyon College speech as well. I think what's a little bit of David that's a bit confusing for people is he can sort of be slotted into a number of different categories depending on what you're interested in. But there was a part of him that was, I think, especially in his Pomona years, pretty conservative. Socially liberal for sure, but kind of conservative about the kinds of things that are often kicked around the academy, like, is standard English just a dialect? Well, maybe it's a dialect, but when you leave here, you're going to damn well have to speak it, or you're going to be nowhere. I mean, that would be something he would have thought.
I was really struck by how little of you is in the biography.
A little bit.
Right. Yeah, I think the second sentence, you say the day he was born, and the book ends with his death.
Yeah.
There's very little synthesis, I guess, or judgment passed on the work and its literary status. Was there a reason you deliberately tried to write such a fact-based biography?
Well, yeah, I don't actually think that's what I wrote. I mean, I think you've got two slightly different categories in there. There's actually a lot of literary analysis, I think, in the book. It's not, that's something I worked on, I think, pretty extensively. What there isn't in the book, and you're right to quote the beginning and the ending sentences, is I very much deliberately treat David's life as beginning with his birth and ending with his death, whereas most biographers would probably include, an afterword about the influence of his writing. That's within the book, and it's only sort of, I wanted the book to be about the world as David saw it, and so the book does literally end with the moment of his death, and it does literally, the first sentence is, every story has a beginning, and this is David Wallace's. I did these things for a couple of reasons. One, just every piece of writing is a conversation with other pieces of writing, and for me, Justin Kaplan, who's Mark Twain's biographer, died a few days ago, and in the New York Times obituary, they commented about how he had this innovation as a biographer where he'd begun the life in the middle, like, you pull out a moment that's remarkable, and so you start the life with, as Mark Twain stood and received the honors, at the centennial, the Chicago Centennial, you're like, so, but all these innovations become tired, and I felt like I wanted to push very hard against the idea that I was some sort of, screenwriter who simply couldn't get a job, and start with some sort of scenically potent moment, I felt like I was going to do something really quite different. And a little bit of it was an homage to David and the idea, if you like, his books have their ending famously sort of outside the last page, and so my book also, in a funny way, has a kind of ending that you're denied. You're given the literal ending. So I would just distinguish a little bit between, let's say that the kind of writer that I am is somebody who tends to, if you read with care, you'll see I'm gently pressing on this fact, I'm gently pressing on this interpretation. There's somewhere I very distinctly do want you to go, which is, different than judging somebody. I didn't think I was his mother, and I thought each of you had the maturity to look at the sort of things David did or didn't do. We each bring our own autobiography to reading a biography.
Another question? Back there?
Here.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to his influences, more to sort of like someone who had such an interest in systems and grammar and such, probably had like a very specific self-curated sense of where he fell into like literary history, or not just who his immediate peers were, but like historically who his peers might be. And I know I've read a little bit about, but like maybe speak to like the notes he would make and kind of markup of in his library, what you make of that.
You may know as much as I do about how he saw himself in literary history. When you were with him, was that ever some, obviously it wouldn't have been a direct discussion, but.
Well, I think the two names that came up the most, and this is not at all surprising, it's all of your book as well, right, are Franzen and DeLillo in terms of his contemporaries at different levels, both like somebody who's like completely his contemporary and someone to whom, whose work he takes very seriously and aspires to and like admires DeLillo's productivity. And I think, you capture a lot of that back history in terms of him discovering postmodernism when he's in college, right? Reading Pynchon, for instance, and then also very quickly pushing against that kind of metafiction. So that's at least part of that history, as I understand it.
I think, David was a wide reader, and I think he read, to some extent, different parts of his life the way he watched TV. Read anything. So the usual game of did David read doesn't work that well, because David read a lot of things. But when you actually ask yourself, like, what mattered to him, and I write this in every love story, I think a relatively small number of books actually mattered to David. I think, his game was always that big novel that was, he's a child of the Academy. It was very, very important for David for his books to be admired on campus. Like, no matter what he might have said about it, the Academy was where he found his reality. It's where he had lived his entire life. And so, William Gass, or William Gaddis, or Vollman, the postmodernists, although, David was also sort of a devourer and then a spitter-outer of things, and the postmodernists he sort of devoured and then grew angry. He didn't like to be seduced, and one thing that happens to him, especially in his 20s, is, he finds postmodernism and just loves it so much. He feels he's really come to hear his own voice in his head. That moment as a reader where you feel like you're reading somebody and it's the sound of your own voice. It's you thinking. So that's what happened with the postmodernists. And then I think for both biographical reasons and just because he was so smart that he tended to devour and move on, he grew to hate the postmodernists. And then the story Westward, The Course of Empire, is an attack on John Barth, which is an odd thing. A lot of people, when David was attacking John Barth, which is I think 1987, a lot of people were like, why are you bothering? No one reads John Barth anyway. It wasn't as if Barth was, this isn't 1978 and John Barth is on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. He was sort of kicking a guy down the stairs in terms of the extent to which the world was focused on him. And actually, there's an early version of Westward that I saw where John Barth is named in the story Westward, The Course of Empire. Although he's not the main figure, Stephen Ambrose, who's the creative writing teacher, he actually has a small role as the forger. How well you remember the story, but the figure of David in the second part of the story is locked in jail with a forger, or an embezzler, I can't remember which. Anyway, and that character is given the name of John Barth in the original version. But I think that he never entirely wavered from, admiring the kinds of novels that I guess, we could say, just to do a little quick free psychoanalysis, represented a combination of his father and his mother's passion. So, the sort of big white academic 800-page books were always, I think, the books he had on his mind to either equal or excel. I would say DeLillo was a little bit of a sidetrack for him. I think he admired most of all in DeLillo, probably, I think DeLillo's stance as a writer, as Patrick said, DeLillo's discipline as a writer. David projected on DeLillo both a purity that I don't think Don feels he possesses, and also a kind of high literary, kind of a gravitas to his creativity, a way to be a serious writer in America without going around saying, I am a serious writer in America. Just a kind of quiet way to do your work and put it out regularly. I'm not sure that Don would see his own work that way at all. I think he probably sees it as full of stresses. But for David, it was necessary to create this person. So another way of saying this is there are vast amounts of recent American writing which David may well have read, but I don't think particularly mattered to him. I don't think he particularly cared about the kind of the writing of a Sherman Alexie or a Junot Diaz. I don't think these were people he disliked, or a Laurie Moore. He was, I think, a friend of Laurie Moore's. Any of the sort of the writers who have a certain gift for character and an ability to grab the reader. I don't think he particularly felt he should be those writers, and I don't think that they registered very deeply for him. I think he had this very narrow, very intense admiration, for that kind of book that lives, that really first finds it finds readers and it finds its place in the academy. It has to be explicated, but it can be read without explication. And of course, he wasn't that fond of the academic writing, so it was an odd sort of affection that he had.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, remember him having like a deep awe, which is not surprising, of Underworld in particular, and recommending that I read Cosmopolis. So even the kind of novels of DeLillo's that hadn't gotten rave reviews, right, were still on his list of best. He loved Underworld, yeah.
He loved DeLillo. Who doesn't feel a kind of spillover affection to the writer for the books of the people who you love and whose gestalt is like totally right.
Totally.
Because Underworld in a way wouldn't really fit this group. DeLillo in a way is a different kind of writer. I mean, I think I'm clumping up a lot of things together here. But I feel that DeLillo was almost more of an atmospheric influence on David. When he writes to DeLillo, he writes up. For a long time I couldn't figure out why he was shitting on all these novels I thought he liked. And then I realized he was writing to DeLillo. And so he's sort of showing he's a human being. He's showing his haute literary credentials. He's putting down books that probably when he would write to another writer he would have praised.
Yeah, it's an interesting too that he's writing to this maximalist writer, but in many cases writing in the form of the postcard. So there's this kind of minimalist constraint.
Well, he was
yeah.
He was jealous that DeLillo had such great postcards.
Yeah.
But
And in fact, yeah.
Always there's a play acting aspect to David's behavior, right? I mean, David was aware that carrying around sort of Care Bear notebooks was, to put in his thoughts was he was at once saying something, denying he was saying it, and then simultaneously letting you in on something that he would very much feel was important. So in the case of postcards, the gesture wasn't casual. And in fact, I think he worked quite hard to find interesting postcards to send to his friends. I'll give you another example. He sent Christmas cards, I think. David Foster Wallace was well enough aware of the world to understand he was probably the only writer in his group who was sending Christmas cards. He wasn't under the impression. It comes down to some of the qualities that we might associate with a kind of rural Midwestern aspect of his personality, where they were sincere, they were retained, I think, deliberately when he saw others' behavior. And to some extent, he denied the deliberateness of retaining them.
Yeah. And I actually want to suggest something a little non-intuitive in response to your question about what the influences might have been. And I want to add two categories to this mix. You can totally push back if you want. One is science fiction, and the other is self-help books. So while I was staying in his place, this was one of my first introductions to self-help books because they were everywhere. And I kind of hated them, but I started reading them cover to cover just to get a sense of what the form was like, because I realized I also, disliked them but didn't have good reason for that, given my history of reading. But the other piece is science fiction, right? So like, one of the shared loves that we had was The Matrix and the Matrix trilogy. We actually went to see the second Matrix film together when it first came out on not even opening night. It was like a pre-release or something. And then had like a long 2-hour conversation about The Matrix Reloaded. He was skeptical, but I kept trying. We had just read Baudrillard together, so I kept trying to sell him on the architect scene, actually being a kind of like sharp rereading of Baudrillard, and he seemed open to the idea. I don't know what he was thinking, you know. But so there's The Matrix, but also like I was telling you right before this that I had this stack of books in the room where I was staying in his place, and one of those was Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, and there was a moment where he came in and stole the book and started reading it as a way of procrastinating, and or this is what he described himself as doing. And so, there's not a kind of like direct influence of science fiction. There is a kind of surrealism or hyperrealism in his work, but Infinite Jest could be called a science fiction novel. From the System too, yeah.
Both set slightly in the future.
Yeah. So.
No, I think that's completely right. I think David, like most writers, would take the things he was interested in from the things he was reading, and certainly science fiction would have been congenial to him. And I think actually, he also, we haven't talked about this, but he was a great reader of trashy novels, and I write about this a little bit in the book. I think there's a number of reasons. One, again, not to hit on this too often, but he liked the fact that people were amazed that David Foster Wallace was reading trashy novels. He would pretend, I think, that mattered not at all to him. But I think he was hearing frequencies and overtones of the frequencies and overtones of those frequencies. That's just who he was. But he also liked the fact that, trashy novels don't bother with character, so you can really see the mechanics of plot. I think David was always wondering, if you look at Pale King, it's not clear he ever decided on a plot. Maybe he decided there wouldn't be a plot. Infinite Jest, on the other hand, is a classic, on some level is a classic sort of crime novel, right? With a mystery about who has this video cartridge. So I think he took what he wanted, but I do think when he put his toe in the water of genre, science fiction would be a logical one for him.
Do we have to stop? I just want to double check if we have maybe one more question. Eric?
So I guess I sort of was struck over the course of your conversation about sort of these two seemingly very different type of impulses in the writing. So early on, you guys both talked about sort of writing as I guess a self-help, sort of teaching himself sort of empathic qualities, and also sort of working through a lot of these personal issues. But then sort of later on, talk about obviously writing is a teaching tool and the thing for the reader to tilt at and challenge them. And I guess I'm curious if either of you have thoughts on sort of the relationship between those two things and sort of writing for I guess this himself and writing to help the reader, I guess.
You can take this one.
You go first.
I don't know. This goes back to the question earlier, of the balance between wanting to produce a failed entertainment and something that really does speak to readers. So I think that's that back and forth of writing for himself and satisfying himself and being his own harshest critic in some ways, and then writing for an audience was a live tension rather than one that I see as being resolved at any moment.
I'd agree. As one of the pleasures of writing the biography, and one of the reasons that I wanted to write about David, was that I feel that and one of the tragedies of his death, too, is that he was, I still think in some ways, a person in the process of becoming all through his life. It makes him a fascinating person to write about. And I think that's probably true in his fiction as well. If you look at John Franzen's writing, not to simplify, I think John's very certain who he wants to be as a writer, what his style should be, what his function is, how to reach the reader, and how to be the person who is that writer. I don't think David ever had quite so much of a stasis. And the Pale King, it's very hard to know why the Pale King couldn't quite get written. Honestly, it's just really impossible to know. But I think one way to understand it is that the person David wanted to become was a person David wasn't naturally. And while he could make inroads into becoming that person and becoming that person as a writer, although they're not identical, his body kept snapping back with a kind of natural tension, or his personality kept snapping back with a natural tension to who he was more. I'm not sure Patrick and I would necessarily agree on this, but I mean, you know, as you talk in a conversation like this, you do become more or less sure of things that you've said other times or never said before. And I do think actually that as I think about it, you know, the Pale King, to me, in a lot of ways, exists in a kind of neurotic anxiety about the question between entertaining the reader and proving that entertaining the reader isn't what he as a writer needs to do. It's almost like going to a party and never being quite sure. This is to simplify an interesting book, and a book I think is very worth reading, but it's almost like going to a party and never being entirely sure whether you should be charming or the strong silent type. You know what I mean? Like how at a party you have to interpret yourself to others. And this is something David, I know, is very aware of, for instance, literally in going to a party or any group. And I think if you just look at the Pale King, you can find so many different kinds of Davids. It's fun in that way, you know, from Drinyan. David was, I think, in later life a superb listener. Drinyan is a man who listens so well that he actually can levitate out of the seat. By the way, I think it's Drinyan who is the grown-up version of the little child in Incarnations of Burned Children. I believe that was one of his intentions. But then he's also, is it Cusk, the guy who sweats uncontrollably in grade school or in junior high? I mean, that clearly was literally David. You know, the icky nice, is it Stike who's the icky nice one? I can never remember any characters' names. Okay. Anyway, and then, you know, there's the classic, the Wastoid. Someone help me with the name of the Wastoid. Fogel, right, thank you. So the wonderfully named Chris Fogel, who sits there watching as the world turns. I mean, you know, I think that for David is, these were all pieces of him, and that's not unusual in a novel, but I think what's tragic, interesting, and worth considering is if you don't actually sort this out for yourself as a writer so that it exists in some sort of stasis, if you wake up every morning trying to understand which of these people you're going to be, I mean, I think it can make he had the novel in his garage. That's, you know, he had this space dedicated to working on it, and I think that can sort of make the trip to the garage a very hard one.
So let's end there and thank DT Max for his visit.